I debated for a while how to preach this series of messages over the next couple days. I know where we wanted to go, but I didn't quite know how to get there in a timely fashion. We're going to use tonight to kind of set up our messages for the next couple of days. Ultimately, we're going to end up in Acts chapter 27, but we're going to take the long way around. We're going to, Lord willing, hopefully it won't take us too long tonight, but we're going to start in Acts chapter 20. In Acts chapter 20, we find Paul starting his last series of journeys, if you will. Paul has traveled, a faithful missionary for the Lord, and now he's on his way to Rome. And ultimately that was Paul's destination. His purpose from the beginning was to get to Rome and testify of Christ, which we'll see tonight and tomorrow. And Acts chapter 20 kind of starts off that journey. Paul begins by issuing a final farewell to the Ephesian elders. We won't take the time to read it, but you read Acts chapter 20 and you really get a glimpse inside of Paul's heart. How he loved the churches, he loved its pastors, he loved the people. Paul begins by talking about his history with these men in these churches. He talks about he has not failed to preach to them the whole counsel of God. How he left nothing back from them. He taught all the scriptures as the Lord had given him. He talks about how he was trying and hoping to finish his course well. That was Paul's main goal in life. He wanted to finish his course, finish his race well, so that he'd be able to hear, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." And in doing so, he reminds them how he is free from the blood of all men. He kept nothing back. He preached the whole gospel of God. And then he begins to warn them of things to come. He tells them after he leaves that wolves were going to come in and try to tear the churches apart. And that is so true in the world today. We see many churches when they transition from pastor to another pastor for retirement or health issues, whatever it may be, problems can arise. Our conference back home, the whole theme was continuing, and how churches need to continue and how we can continue as churches. And Paul's reminding them that people are going to come in, deceivers, false prophets, false teachers, that are going to try to tear them apart. He encourages them to set a watch among the people. To watch the church, watch for those outsiders coming in, watch for those deceivers, to guard their hearts, guard their minds, and guard the truth. He encourages them to remember the things that they have been taught. Hopefully we all heed those warnings today. We need to remember those things which we have been taught. If you look in verse number 36 of Acts chapter 20, Paul, after he gives his final exhortation, words of encouragement, words of warning, getting ready to leave, embark on his final journey, ultimately again towards Rome. At this point, he's working towards Jerusalem. But in verse 36, it says, "And when he had thus spoken, he kneeled down and prayed with them all." The last thing Paul did with these men was to pray. We need more prayer in our lives. Paul emphasizing all these things to come, and he took time to pray in his final moments with these men. I often wondered, before we say goodbye to our loved ones, when they travel, maybe they're traveling or moving far away, how do we spend those last few moments? I think we should be like Paul and pray. These men prayed with Paul. He said he kneeled down and prayed with them all, and when they all wept sore and fell on Paul's neck and kissed him. This shows how much Paul was loved. Verse 38 says, "Sorrowing most of all for the words which he spake, that they should see his face no more, and they accompanied him unto the ship." We see Paul's final journey beginning by getting onto the ship, surrounded by those that loved him, appreciated him. Paul not knowing exactly what was about to come, but he knew that he was never going to see these men again. Again, he didn't know how it was going to happen, and that's important. We'll get to that in a moment. He didn't understand what was going to happen, but he did know he was never coming back to this place again. Think about how we would be on that journey. Today, we have the luxury. We move. We can get in a car and travel, get in an airplane and travel. But Paul leaving, knowing he'll never come back, knowing his time is coming to an end. We come to chapter 21 and skip down to verse 26. We see a common theme in Paul's life. You go from the point of his conversion to the time of his death. One thing is continuant in Paul's life. Everywhere he goes, he gets ridiculed, mocked. He gets kicked out of town, if you will. Everywhere he goes. But all for preaching the gospel of Christ. And that's what he's doing here. And you think about it, how would we spend our last days on this earth? Again, Paul didn't know how long he was going to have, whether it be days or years or months, but he knew this was his final journey. He spent it praying with the brethren and preaching the gospel of Christ. In chapter 21 and verse 26, we find that says, "Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place.' For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus and Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple." So here we have Paul doing what he always did, doing what he's called to do, and preach the gospel of Christ. And people come to cause trouble. And notice these people weren't the locals in the town. These people purposely followed Paul everywhere he went to stir up a mob against him. These people were so distraught by the preaching of Paul, they wanted everywhere to feel the same. So they gather together, they gather the people, tell them that he's blaspheming, he's preaching false teachings. In verse 30 says, "And all the city was moved, and the people ran together. And they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came into the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul." This mob comes about, and this isn't something new for Paul. You go to every city he's ever been, and a mob rises up against him. Paul is no stranger to beatings. He's no stranger to mocking and criticizing. But think about our flesh, how weary, how tired we would become for doing the right thing, preaching the gospel, and always getting beaten for it, or arrested for it, or people causing problems. You got to imagine Paul was getting a little tired. The same thing over and over again. They rise up a mob once again, trying to kill Paul. The soldiers come and intervene. Verse 33 says, "Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another." And that's the way the world is today. They say whatever they can to hinder the proclamation of the gospel. They didn't know what Paul was guilty of. They were just trying to throw things out there, see whatever stuck. But they began to throw out these accusations. It says, "Among the multitude, and when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, 'Away with him.'" Again, we see Paul being beaten, being carried away by soldiers needed for his protection, going away in shackles and chains as a prisoner, all for doing what he himself, as well as us today, are called to do. Everybody in this room is called to preach the gospel of Christ. So to go out, witness, proclaim the words of Christ. This is what Paul was doing here. We see great violence against Paul. Again, followed him everywhere. But what does Paul do? What would we do in this situation? And remember, Paul has done this time and time again. We're going through Job in Sunday school back home. We get to the point where he's depressed, discouraged, beaten down. And then I think I probably would do the same. I wouldn't fault Paul here for being a little depressed or discouraged. But what does Paul do? Jump down to verse 39. It says, "But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people." So Paul, as he is being carried away in chains for preaching the gospel, he asked the soldiers, just give me one more minute to speak to the people. Speak to the very people who have beaten him, cried away with him, carried him away to prison. He pleads for one last moment to speak. It says in verse 40, "And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there he made great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, Men, brethren, and fathers, hear my defense, which I make now unto you." Paul wanted to preach some more. How many of us, after being beaten, taken away in chains, would ask for 5 more minutes to preach? Paul didn't quit. He didn't want to quit. He wanted to continue. And that comes to chapter 22, where he begins to tell his defense. This isn't something new for Paul again. He has told the same account many times before. But he tells us the story of his conversion. We know it well. On his way on the Damascus road, the Lord shone about him, blinded him, rebuked him for what he's done, told him it was hard to kick against the pricks, and sent him to Ananias. And he preaches the gospel once again. The easiest way for us to preach the gospel today is tell our own testimony. I struggled with that for so long. You talk about, how do you witness to somebody? I don't know the scriptures like I should. I don't know where to start. I fumble over my words. How do you witness? But as Christ told the man that he healed of the legions of demons, just go tell what the Lord had done for you. It's that simple. And this is what Paul was doing here. Paul could have spoke, and he was a Pharisee. He was all these things. Well-educated. But all he did was give his testimony. The most powerful thing we can do is tell what the Lord did for us. And that's what Paul did here. He begins to tell his testimony, saying, this is what happened to me. And this is why I must preach the gospel of Christ. Skip down to verse 22 of chapter 22. After he gave his testimony, if you will, 22 says, "And they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live." This angered the people even more. The world today does not want to hear the gospel. They need to hear it. We need to preach it. But it angers them. And it angered these people. It got to the point where they said, "Away with him. He doesn't deserve to live. We need to kill him now." 23 says, "And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust in the air, a riot breaks out. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. See, the world gets so distraught and so angry at the things of God, they don't know what they're doing. They wanted Paul beaten and killed, and they didn't know he was a Roman. They were not allowed to beat a Roman citizen. Paul caught him off guard. just by saying, I'm a Roman. You can't do this. Kind of throws their whole plan into disarray. So they gather the council. You read the rest of these verses here. They gather the council around. They sit Paul before them. And they want the council to judge Paul and decide what to do with this man whose only crime was preaching the gospel of Christ. In Acts chapter 23, once again, Paul pleads his case. He goes through his testimony again. He talks about Christ. He talks about the Lord. Again, how many of us would still be preaching the gospel at this moment? How many of us would have given up? How many of us would have taken our wounds, taken our beatings, and just went away to prison or tried to save ourselves? And most of the time, and I probably this would be the same thing, most of the time Paul was said, if you promise not to preach the gospel, we'll let you go. Paul was not about that. He was going to preach with his last breath. He once again has to plead his case, stand before the council, give his testimony once again. More contention arises, and they decide, they can't legally do anything to Paul. So they send him to Governor Felix. They said, surely Felix would know what to do with this man. So Acts chapter 24, we have Paul standing before Felix. He stands before Felix, says the same spiel over and over again, gives the gospel, tells of the Lord, and Felix doesn't know what to do with Paul. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know what to do. He on one side, he has the people, his constituents, keeping him in power, saying to kill him, to crucify him, to lock him up and throw away the key. On the other hand, even Felix knew that Paul did no wrong. So he places him under house arrest. In chapter 24 and verse number 27, it says, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So Felix placed Paul under house arrest for about 2 years. He allowed people to come and go, to come and see Paul, to minister to him, to meet him. But Paul wasn't allowed to leave the city. He wasn't allowed to be a free man in the way that we're free today for 2 years. Because Felix wanted no part of doing something against Paul. And along comes Festus. Comes over, takes over as governor. Felix's last thing, he could have pardoned Paul. Today, what do our presidents do when they leave office? They pardon people. But Festus chose to keep him bound to show the Jews a pleasure. He gave in to their peer pressure. He gave in to the things of this world to allow Paul to stay under arrest. So now we have Festus taken over in chapter 25. Paul stands before Festus. Once again, he does the same thing. Finally, we see Paul getting a little tired, I think. In chapter 25 and verse 11, he says, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. Paul just finally says, if I did something worthy of death, I'll die. But there's nothing they have to accuse me of that's worthy of death. And then he says, I appeal unto Caesar. Finally, he says, you know what? I appeal unto Caesar, the highest power in the land. I'm done dealing with the council. I'm done dealing with the governor and all these other men. I want to deal with the highest authority in the secular world as Caesar. But before that happens, King Agrippa comes to town. King Agrippa decides he wants to hear what this man is all about. He wants to hear the commotion, what the commotion's all about. He wants to hear what Paul has to say. So in chapter 26, Paul begins to stand before Agrippa. Has to give the same spiel over and over again. Tells him of his testimony, tells him who the Lord is, preaches Christ, does the same thing. Recounts his conversion again. And then we go down to verse number 6. It says, and now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers. And this verse is important. Remember it for tomorrow, please. He says that he stand being judged all for the hope of the promise made of God unto their fathers. The promise that he gave to Abraham and Moses and all the rest. This is only Paul's only crime. For hoping, trusting in that promise. And then you skip down to verse number 27. Says, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Paul says, King Agrippa, I know you know the prophets. I know you believe the Old Testament. I know you believe what they said. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. One of the saddest phrases in the Bible. Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Agrippa was close, but didn't trust the Lord. If you're here today, I hope you're not almost persuaded. I hope the Lord takes control of your heart tonight. But he says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Verse 29 says, and Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. And when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor and Bernice, and they sat with him, and they that sat with him. And when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, this man doeth nothing worthy of death or of bonds. King Agrippa talking to his wife, saying, this man did nothing wrong. All he was doing was preaching the gospel, speaking the truth, did nothing wrong worthy of death. He doesn't even deserve to be in prison. Then said Agrippa unto Festus, this man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar. King Agrippa said he would have let him go. If Paul would have waited just one more time, if Paul just would have went through one more little fake trial, King Agrippa would have set him free. I often wonder, after all Paul went through, why didn't he appeal to Caesar after the council? Why didn't he appeal to Caesar after Felix? Why did he persevere through all that and then appeal to Caesar in this moment? The Lord had a plan for Paul. That plan was not for him to be set free. That plan was for him to appeal to Caesar. So he appealed to Caesar. Agrippa agreed that this man should be let go. However, he already said he appealed to Caesar. Now he has to go. He has to go to Rome. Chapter 27, we see Paul on his journey to Rome. On a ship full with other prisoners, under armed guard, on his way to Rome. In chapter 27 and verse 9, we see Paul issuing a warning to the sailors. He says, now when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading of the ship, but also of our lives. Paul told them of a storm that's coming. That it was going to be a storm so great that was going to threaten not only their ship, but their lives. Now, an ordinary prisoner might have said this just to try to get out of trouble. Remember, Paul wanted to go to Rome. It was by his choice he's going to Rome at this point. Paul was not trying to get out of the journey. He was just trying to say, delay it a couple of days. Let the storm pass. But he warns of this storm that's about to take place. The centurion, knowing better than Paul, decides to set sail. They begin their journey towards Rome. And in verse number 18, it says, and we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. We see Paul and the rest of the men on the ship encounter a great storm. A storm like no other, the storm that Paul warned about. And we took all this time to get to this point. Storms in life are guaranteed. Paul did nothing wrong, nothing deserving, but a storm still came about. Christ is never shy about talking about the truth of the Christian life. Many people today want to say, oh, the Christian life is a bed of roses, it's perfect, it's loving, it's all this. Christ himself says he sends them forth as sheep among wolves, as lambs to the slaughter. He tells them they'll have no place to lay their head. He tells them a difficult journey that Christianity is. John 16:33, he says, in the world ye shall have tribulation. He tells his people, you are going to have storms in your life. Everyone in this room has either gone through a storm, going through a storm, or will go through a storm. And then that just repeats itself. We go through storms in life. Difficulties come in our life. They often happen when we don't expect it. How often have we prepared for a storm that never came? How often have we done everything we could preparing for a storm, whether it be a financial difficulty, whether it be a family difficulty, whether it be some other hardship? We've taken time to prepare and it never came. How many people remember Y2K? People prepared for that storm of life for a long time. It never came. But how often have we been hit by a storm that we never prepared for? Far too often. We cannot predict the weather, and we cannot predict when a storm is going to come in our life. It just happens. Paul was serving the Lord, doing everything he was supposed to do. He was reading his Bible, he was preaching, he was witnessing, he was going to church when he was able, he was doing everything he possibly could. And yet the storm of the century attacked this ship. We can never let our guard down. As Paul warned those Ephesian elders in chapter 20, that's when Satan tries to creep in. The moment we let our guards down, the moment that we let our watch down, is when the storms are going to come. We want to notice real quick what the men did on this ship. And again, hopefully this all sets up for our thoughts for the rest of this weekend. But we want to notice what the men did. In Acts chapter 27 and verse 16, they're in the midst of this storm. Now this was the sailors' job. They made this journey countless times to and from Rome, carrying prisoners back and forth, earning their living, earning their wages. They've no doubt been in storms before. They've traveled these waters before. But in verse number 16, it says, in running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and so were driven. They attempted everything they could to secure their lifeboat. And that's the boat they're talking about, not the ship they were in. They were talking about the lifeboat they would use to get to shore or to abandon ship if necessary. They did everything they could to save their lifeboat. They pulled it up out of the storm, out of the waters, into the ship to save it from being beaten. It says they gathered help, so they were enlisting the help of every man on that ship, sailor, prisoner, soldier alike, to gather this boat, to lift it, hoist it up into the ship. It says they girded it about, which they were tying ropes around it to try to strengthen it. They were trying to hold that lifeboat together with everything they could, doing everything they possibly could to preserve their lifeboat. And then they took down their sails to preserve them. They knew the storm was going to tatter their sails. Without their sails, they'd have no sense of direction. They wouldn't be able to control the ship or to go wherever they needed to go. So they let their sails down and let the storm take its course. They were attempting everything they could. How often in storms do we do everything we can to get out of it? How often do we attempt to save our lifeboat? One thing Pastor said it again this weekend. He talked about his house here, about how briefly he thought about keeping it. But when he came to 12 Orion and he talked about it, he said he didn't want a lifeboat back home. He didn't want a place to run to, so he cut that lifeboat away. He sold his house. He was all in. But these men here were saving their lifeboat, afraid from the storm. And in verse number 18, it says, and we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. So the first day they saved their lifeboat. They were trying to hope, well, if we save the lifeboat, we can survive. But the next day, the storm was still raging, and they began to lighten the ship. And this would have been them throwing away all the merchandise, everything that wasn't necessary on the ship. So all the things that they were using to make money by traveling to and from, they were throwing it overboard. After all, it's somebody else's stuff. They didn't really care about it that much. They wanted their lives more than they wanted those wages. But they were throwing everything they could to lighten the ship. You know, we do that sometimes, don't we? We enter a storm of life and we just do everything we can to weather the storm, to lighten the load. And then verse 19, the third day. So the third day, they're still battling the storm. It says, we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. This would have been all the necessary things. This would have been their navigation equipment. This would have been their daily rations of food. This would have been literally anything they can get their hands on. They were throwing it overboard. They were becoming desperate. When we encounter storms of life, we get a little desperate, don't we? You know, we let the storm take over. We get fearful. We get afraid. We get discouraged. And we get a little dramatic sometimes. The sky is falling. And we do everything we can to get out of it. We start throwing things overboard, casting things out of our lives to try to right our own ship. Verse number 20. It says that when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. You see how sad this story takes now? It says all hope that we should be saved was taken away. They did everything they could. Everything, humanly speaking, they could. All their naval training, all their techniques, everything they've done in past that have worked, they did everything. And they finally lost all hope. So here are these men on this ship. They lost everything. They've thrown everything overboard. They're fearful for their lives, and now they're hopeless. You know, one of the greatest things to keep people motivated is hope. You know, if people have hope, they keep fighting. When people lose hope, that's when they stop fighting and give up. And these men are at that point. They completely give up. They've lost all hope. How many of us have felt that way a time or two? We've gone through a great storm in our life and we got to the point where we just feel hopeless. We feel helpless. We've done everything we could by the power of man and nothing ever worked. We get discouraged. We get depressed. And then we come down to verse 29. We'll fill the gaps in tomorrow, Lord willing. We skip down to verse 29, which is our text verse for this weekend. It says, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. After everything else failed, they've done everything in their power, they had one final option. It says they cast 4 anchors and wished for the day. Why 4? Why not 1? Or 2? Or 3? Why 4? 4 was all they had. They knew 1 wasn't going to be enough. They wanted to throw everything they possibly could as a last resort. They threw all 4 anchors out of the ship. And they wished for the day. Hoping, praying that they would just wake up and have daylight. In the storm, and if you read through how dark it was in the storm, they couldn't see shore, they couldn't see land, they couldn't see the dangers ahead. They wanted the day to come. If daylight came, they would have a chance. They could see the dangers, the storm may calm, they'd have hope again. But they cast those 4 anchors into the sea. Again, this was all they could possibly do. Eventually, they're going to cut the ropes of those anchors. They're going to give up all hope. They're going to give everything away that they thought they knew how to do. They're going to cut those ropes and let those anchors drift into the sea. But they gave every effort they had to get out of this storm. Maybe you're facing a storm tonight. Maybe you're struggling to find your lifeboat and secure it. Maybe you're doing everything you can to lighten the load and right the ship. We've all been there. Maybe you're casting your anchors and wishing for tomorrow. You're just hoping, well, if I just, wait a little bit longer, if we could just stay here for a moment, I can breathe a little bit, get a little breathing room. Maybe we've lost all hope, and we're just waiting for a brighter day to come. Again, often we're quick to judge. But if we were in that same situation, I don't know how I would act. Again, going through the book of Job, you read and really read what he went through. And then really read and study what his friends told him, or quote-unquote friends were telling him to do. What his wife told him to do. I don't blame Job for his little moments of outbursts. But maybe that's us tonight, losing all hope, facing a storm. Don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. We know who we can hope in. We know who we can trust in. And the one thing, again, don't rely upon yourself. These men have faced situations like this time and time again. They relied upon themselves, and they failed. They did everything they could, and nothing worked. We're told not to lean on our own understanding or trust in ourselves. Don't rely upon yourself. Turn to Christ. Over the next 2 days, Lord willing, there was jokes that you guys might throw me out of here after tonight. So if you guys allow me to come back tomorrow, Lord willing, we're going to look. Not what the men did in these storms, but what Paul did. We see what the men did. The men failed. They relied upon themselves. They relied upon their strength. They failed. We're going to take the next 2 days and look at what Paul did. How we weather the storm without fear, with no loss of hope. We're going to see the 4 anchors that Paul used to stay steady and calm in the midst of the storm. Those 4 anchors that Paul used are as good for him as they are for us today. Lord willing, we're going to look at those 4 anchors. Again, if you're in a storm today, don't lose hope. Trust in the Lord. Hopefully, we're going to look how Paul did it. Paul, if you'll come.